Amen. Before I start, if you'll allow me, I have just a couple things I want to share. One, if you'd have told me that Johnsons would be sitting in this room this day, I would have said, you're crazy, man. Just a week or so ago, things were looking dicey, don't you think? So, first of all, praise the Lord and thank you for letting us kind of lobby you unmercifully, Lord, that they would be here with us. So that's the first thing. Here's the second thing. It's kind of an anecdote. A week ago tomorrow, last Monday, Clyde had to move some cattle. By the way, I don't know if you knew this, but life kind of goes on during COVID. Who'd have thought that, right? He needed to move some cattle, so I went out to help move with cattle. And Sarah and I had gotten in the Ranger, and we're kind of driving along trying to move these cattle, and they're not doing much for us. And I'm hooping and hollering and yelling, and we're driving behind them. And I look over, and here comes Clyde kind of driving down the road slowly in his truck, and he gets over to where the next pasture is, and the cattle had to go from one pasture across the county road to the other pasture. He opens the gate, and then in this kind of soft voice, which he still has, he goes out to the front of his pickup and he says, "Come, cows." And they come running. We're out there beating ourselves to death, and all he has to do is kind of whisper. And I thought, man, what a perfect analogy for what Jesus does. Isn't that right? He knows his sheep, and he calls them by name, and they come running. And I thought at the time, what a perfect analogy. Now, Clyde, you got to admit you fall a little short of that standard, but still, you get the point, right? That Jesus knows his sheep, and they know him. So I thought you'd enjoy that kind of vignette. And that, by the way, there are still strays that Sarah and I chased for some time after that. But so those are just kind of some opening remarks. I wanted to point out one other thing, and then we'll start. If you had told me a year and a half ago that in November 2021 we'd still be dealing with COVID issues, I'd have said, you're crazy. At the time, all of us, this was, February, March back then, all of us were thinking, okay, a couple weeks and this is over. Well, guess what? It's still kind of with us. And we're going to deal a little bit with that. But let me start out by saying this. I'm not supposed to be here. As probably all of you have heard now, I got a phone call at 6:27 on Friday morning from Alexander. Actually, it was not a phone call, it was a text. Let me tell you how I know this was serious. I don't know that Alexander knows there's a 6 a.m. He knows there's a 6 p.m., but he is not a morning kind of guy. He goes late into the night, but his clock and my clock are not the same. So if I get a text from him at 6:27 in the morning, I know something's amiss. Well, the text said that the night before, Thursday night, in Christian Challenge, that they had a good Christian Challenge meeting. A bunch of people showed up, and then he gets home and he gets a phone call, I think, from one of the students at Christian Challenge. He said, there was an envelope, I went and got tested, and I tested positive for COVID. Well, Alexander was clearly disappointed. I called him, and he was clearly disappointed that he wouldn't be here today. I mean, it was almost like he felt devastated. Not only is he not here today, you'll notice the whole Woolsey family also were affected, not by the same infection or the same occurrence. Most of the Christian Challenge, all the Christian Challenge guys were also impacted. So that's kind of why we are where we are today. And then even Jerry Day didn't get COVID, but he went and got his booster shot, and he said he was feeling a little bit of impact. So we're still dealing with some of those issues. And that made me think about last week when we talked about fear. We just touched on it, but I realized there are two other times that provide fertile ground for Satan: anxiety and depression. Now, I want you to think for just a minute. about young Alexander. If anybody has had opportunity for both over the last year and a half to 2 years, it's Alexander. Let me just do kind of a catalog of some things for you here. First of all, I want you to remember, at the time we called him, he was only 25 years old. Now, I want you to think about where you were at 25 years old. Were you ready to walk into a church of mature Christians and be able to deal with them? Probably not. So the first issue, he's a 25-year-old guy thrust into this role of being a lead pastor. In that period of time, we had half a dozen families move away, not because of the church, but because of other circumstances in their lives. And they were dedicated to the church. In fact, there are days that we still will get contributions from those people who have been gone now for over a year. So the second thing that hit him was that this half a dozen families or so moved away. We've had a little death in the church that he's dealt with. COVID-19. Obviously, there were several weeks we couldn't meet in this assembly or any other. Alexander and his family were out for 3 weeks with COVID themselves, and not only that, but they got to enjoy that 3 weeks with the Story Boys, who also had it at the same time. So all of these things, and then there's a couple of others I want to hit. Christian Challenge at the time, they were, it wasn't unusual to have 30 kids show up. I call them kids, young adults, show up for Christian Challenge. Last year, we did one of the last meals for them that they had during COVID, had 3 people show up. And then finally, just standard COVID losses. Do you know that 1 out of 3 Christians no longer attend a church since the beginning of COVID? Now, some of them may be doing it online or other ways, but there has just been a general departure from the church over this period of time. Think about that for just a minute. All of those things I just listed off, Alexander has dealt with in the last year and a half to 2 years. So I got to, and I kind of teased him about it, because I joked, when I talked to him on the phone, I jokingly said, "Is this Alexander Job Turbovich?" And he kind of laughed, but I could tell he was disappointed. So the more I got to thinking about it, I got to thinking, you know what? There are some things we can learn from the book of Job. So I want to spend a little time in the book of Job. Now let me set the stage first. And let me make sure you understand this. This is not one of my favorite books. Several times you've heard me say this is a favorite book, and typically it is. This isn't one of them. But there are many lessons to be learned from this book. I get frustrated with Job, not so much with Job. I get frustrated with his friends. I get frustrated with Job for not telling his friends to go jump in the lake. I generally get frustrated with the book until we get to some of the last chapters, which we'll do here today. Excuse me. Again, not COVID, tuberculosis. Now, a little bit more about the book of Job. It's probably written sometime in Solomon's time, but Job actually lived closer to Abraham's time, maybe even before Abraham. So the effects of the book of Job, the things that happen in the book of Job, happened even before or during the time of Abraham. So it's an old book, 4,000 years or so. And the purposes are threefold. I'm going to use the NIV Study Bible to hit a couple of these purposes because I think they're important. Now, I should tell you, first of all, that I was just going to tell you I thought these things up. And if you're Irish, that's okay to do. You can lie. It's okay, except in church. So otherwise, if you're Irish, it's fine. So I won't tell you that I did these, but I do want to read them to you because it kind of sets the stage for Job. Here's the first point. In the story of Job, the author portrays the adversary in his boldest and most radical assault on God and the godly man, in the special and intimate relationship that is dearest to them both. When God calls up the name of Job before the accuser and testifies to the righteousness of this one on the earth, this man in whom God delights, Satan attempts with one crafty thrust both to assail God's beloved and to show up God as a fool. So the first point is this. The enemy shows up to boldly attack God's people. Here's the second point, and that is God's faith in righteous man. The NIV goes on to say this. It is the adversary's ultimate challenge. For if the godliness of the righteous man in whom God delights can be shown to be the worst of all sins, then a chasm of alienation stands between them that cannot be bridged. Then even redemption is unthinkable. For the godliest of men will be shown to be the most ungodly. God's whole enterprise in creation and redemption will be shown to be radically flawed, and God can only sweep it all away in an awful judgment. So the second thing the book shows is God's faith in a righteous man. The third thing it shows is the value of a righteous man. Those are the things you need to think about. Those are the things you need to focus on when you focus on the book of Job. Don't focus on the problems. Focus on the righteousness and the relationship between God and a righteous man. Now, some of you will know what this means. Let me give you the Cliff Notes version of Job, which is 42 chapters. Now, I know some of you know this. Cliff Notes, for those of you who don't remember, in college, you could go get a book this thick and read the whole book, or you could cheat, which I never did, and go get something called Cliff Notes. And Cliff Notes is about this thick, and it hit all the high points of the book, so you could pretend like you actually read the book. Well, there's some good stuff in it, but basically that was the point, is it just hit the high points. So let me just give you the Cliff Notes of the 42 chapters of Job, which, by the way, is a long book. I suggest you read it, but it's a long book. And I'm going to hit 4 points here. First is Job's life and the challenge and the reactions. First, I want to look at, and some of these, they're in the notes that you've got before you, so all of the citations are in there. If you want to take the time to read them, you can. I'm going to paraphrase some of these, so if I don't hit all of them, you'll kind of understand where I'm going with them. But I want to look first at life before the challenge to Job. And I want to make a point about that. In Job 1 through 3, in the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. Let me point out something to you here. When things are at their best, when things are going swimmingly, as best as you can possibly guess who tends to show up? That's what's going to happen to Job. By all accounts, before his encounter with Satan, everything was, he was in high cotton. There wasn't anything that he lacked for. We're going to see that change here in just a minute. So first, that's the life before. Now, let's look at Satan's challenge in this life, and I want to note 3 things about it. And you're going to find that in Job 1, 6, and 7. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Now, before I make the 3 points about this, I got to tell you, whenever I read this, I get this image of Satan saying, I just came down to catch the Broncos game. Doesn't it sound like I'm just kind of roaming around the earth, right? Well, some people would think catching a Broncos game is similar to going to hell. But you just get this impression that the devil's just kind of roaming around. Well, that's the point, is he's ever present. That's the first thing to think about. And then I want you to look at the challenge in verses 9 through 11. I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to give you the high points. Satan says, have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? Because God has made the point that Job is a righteous man. And Satan says, sure, he's righteous because you've protected him all this time. You've put a hedge around him. You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. Now, here's what I want you to listen to. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. That's the challenge. I want you to look at one more thing. And that's this. The very next verse says this. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Then Satan went out of the presence of the Lord. Do you notice something here? God controls the events. God's the only one that can say, Satan doesn't have the power to do this. God's the only one that can allow these events to happen. So why does he have it happen? He knows what's going to occur, doesn't he? Now, we're going to get a bunch of chapters, and I'll tell you how many here in just a minute, about this issue between Job and his friends. But the point to all of this is God is in control, and God knows the outcome. This is done for two purposes. One, to foil Satan, and two, to show us what a righteous man or woman can do. Now, I want you to look at Job's reaction to all of this. The process starts, and if you read it, you find that he loses his house, he loses his stock, he loses his children, he loses just about everything, right? So, what's his reaction? What would your reaction be? I probably wouldn't be happy about it, right? I want you to listen to Job's reaction. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Keep that in your mind as we go through the rest of us, because that's the definition of a righteous man. Now, here's the second part of this story, of the Cliff Notes, and that's this. And this is the part that frustrates me. For the next 37 chapters, we get this dialogue between Job and three of his friends, right? And the friends accuse Job over and over and over of sin. Let me just give you an example. One of his friends is named Eliphaz. Listen to what Eliphaz says. He takes Job to task and he says, consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. What is this friend of Job saying to Job? This is all your fault. You did something, Job, that has offended the God of the universe. You did it. It's your problem. It's your fault. Right? That sets the stage for the next 37 chapters. What, hon? Okay. I still can catch it, but we'll give her turn here in a minute. That sets the stage for the next 37 chapters. And I want you to look at something in Job's reaction to this, and it kind of tells you kind of how it goes back and forth between these. Because there's a series of speeches that happen. First by the friend, and then Job in response. Then by the friend, and then Job in response. And there's 3 or 4 friends involved here. So here is how Job responds. Job reacts this way. And this is him speaking now to Yahweh. If I have sinned, what have I done to you? You who see everything we do. Why have you made me your target? Have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my offenses and forgive my sins? Job's reaction it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with his friends. He's not really responding to his friends. Who's he responding to? He's responding to God. And guess what? We talked about this in Sunday school. God's got pretty big shoulders. He can handle that. He can handle it when you say, God, why is this happening? He can handle it. But that's the kind of back and forth that we see over the next, as I said, 37 chapters. Now we get to the third part. Now, I told you that there are 42 chapters in this book. If we've only dealt with 37, what happens then? Well, God shows up. Now we get to the best part of the book. And I want you to listen to what happens when God shows up. So God's listened to this for 37 chapters worth. And then in chapter 38, here's what he said. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched out a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy?" Let me paraphrase this as if it were my father speaking to me. Who do you think you are, boy? That's the way he responds to Job. In other words, he's saying, okay, you think you know everything? Well, all right, who hung the moon and the stars? Who did this? Who did that? Who did this? Who did that? Do you really want to question where things are going with the one who set everything in motion? Job's reaction in his response, I think, is a great response. Then Job replied to the Lord, "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." After 37 chapters of arguing with his friends, finally hits Job, right? Job knows who's running the show now, right? And he says, I repent of everything. His biggest sins would have been questioning the Lord to begin with, right? Questioning the Lord because of his friends. So, the summary of all this is in the kind of the fourth part of it. God thwarts Satan's attempts on a righteous man, and he returns Job to his previous life. So now you don't even have to read the book, because you just got the Cliff Notes version, right? 37 chapters of wah, 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 and then God shows up. Makes it pretty easy, right? Well, so what? That was kind of fun, but so what? What does this mean to me? This book was written 4,000 years ago, or the events of it were 4,000 years ago. How does what happened to Job have any effect on me? Well, I call these the 4 B's. Now, usually there should be 3 B's, but in this case we're going to have, you get a bonus. You get a 4th B for free. Here are the 4 B's I want you to think about, because every book in the Bible has something to say to you. Every book and everything in the Bible has something to say to you. Well, maybe you can ignore the endless genealogies and numbers, but even that has something to say. The point is, there's something in the book of Job that we should know, that we should learn. We're going to learn 4 things from the book of Job. The first one is this: be wary. The reading that we did a few minutes ago from 1 Peter is the enemy crouches outside your door. We read something about that when we talked about Cain and Abel. And God said to Abel, the enemy, in this case he called it sin, is outside your door. At the time, there was a Babylonian theme that pictured a huge monster just standing outside the door waiting to devour you. Let me give you the best example I can of this. When we lived up on Crestview, we had, every time, about this time of year, we'd have bears show up almost every night. Well, the first time I learned that, we hadn't been in the house very long, I walked out the back door to take our dog for a walk, and not 10 feet away from me was a bear. This bear, and I swear this is the truth, this bear was 16 feet tall and weighed 6,000 pounds. I'm telling you, that is true. At least he looked to me like that. Didn't take long for me to figure out to turn out and walk back in the house. Lurking outside the door is the enemy. Now, it would be a whole lot easier, wouldn't it, if he ran around with a pitchfork and horns and a tail and be able to identify him? Excuse me. He doesn't. Today, he runs around in certain things going on in our society that are designed to plant division, to plant questions, to plant concerns in our minds. Things like, I'm just going to use a few things from the news today, critical race theory, gender dystopia. At this point, one of the things that you see more than anything else is all of us are racist, apparently. And there's not one of us that doesn't have a racist bone in our body. That's what the enemy looks like today. The enemy isn't covert. The enemy is insidious. And insidious means it kind of worms its way in, just like it did with Eve, right? And what did he do with Eve? With Eve, he just kind of planted a little question, didn't he? He just said, oh, did God really say that? Well, how often does something like that happen to us? So here's the first lesson. Be wary. That doesn't mean you got to walk around all the time cowering. It just means be on the lookout for when Satan attacks, because it happens all the time. Here's the second B. Be silent. You're going to say, well, I don't get that. Be silent? Well, let's go back to Job's friends for a minute. I want to point something out to you. Back in chapter 2, when Job's friends first show up, listen to what is said about them. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. If you're ever put in a position where there is someone you're helping through an anguished moment or through disappointment or through discouragement, let me suggest this. Just shut up. Don't say a word. Do what Job's friends did. They just sat beside him. Ultimately, the only words that person needs to hear is this: I will be with you. Now, if they want something more, trust me, they're going to tell you. But in the meantime, the most important thing you can do, and we might even make another B out of it, is just be there. Now, should probably also point out that we know this book was fairly early, because if the three friends would have had the book of Psalms, all they would have had to do is read the book of Psalms, and it says, be still and know that I am God. Well, everything worked well with the three friends until they opened their mouths. So the second is, be silent. So first, be wary. Second, be silent. Third is, be faithful. If you are in the position of anxiety or disappointment or discouragement, be faithful. And we get a pretty good example of that from Job. Listen to what Job says all the way back in the second chapter. After his whole world has been decimated, here's what happens. His wife said to him, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. He replied, you're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So be wary, be silent, be faithful, and perhaps most importantly, if you're dealing with somebody in anxiety or depression or disappointment, be merciful. God demonstrates that in the last chapter. And here's what he says. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. And it goes on and it finishes up. that he had blessed him immeasurably. So everything that he had lost, God returns to Job. God showed mercy to Job. I do have to tell you one thing. Just you'll kind of get a kick out of this, I think. Before he does that, he takes the three friends to task, and he says, what were you guys thinking? I'm going to have Job pray for you. This guy that you thought was a sinner, he's going to be the one to pray for you. So God even helps correct things with those who were not merciful by showing his mercy. So if you're ever in the situation that we've talked about today, anxiety, depression, any of those concerns, be wary, be silent, be faithful, be merciful.